Hello, I'm Hugh Aljoe. I'm a pasture and range consultant here at the Samuel Roberts Noble Foundation. And this is part two of a two-part series on stocking rate decisions and pasture management considerations. In this section, we're going to look at pasture management considerations only. If we refer back to our first section that we covered, stocking rate decisions, we learned that if we stock at a relatively conservative stocking rate, we provide ourselves up flexibility and opportunity to do some things such as drought proofing our ranch, allowing some pasture recovery during the active growing season. We can retain ownerships of our calf crop and have some alternative marketing that could occur through a value-added program, or we can add strategic enterprises such as hay or other types of cattle operations. Without a conservative stocking rate, these opportunities are somewhat limited. As we go forward, we're going to talk a little bit more about drought proofing the ranch and spend a little more time on pasture recovery and management. And at the very end, we'll talk a little bit about other considerations that as a producer you need to be thinking about in preparation for some of these drought type climate conditions that we can find ourselves in as we go forward into the future. So let's look first at drought proofing our ranch. When I was back in college, one of my professors, Mr. Wayne Hamilton, had stated to us as a class, the time to start planning for rain is when we're in a drought, but the time to start planning for a drought is when it's raining. Bottom line is that we always need to be planning for whatever type of climate conditions we might find ourselves in. It shouldn't be a surprise to us when it gets here. Now, we talk about the rainfall that occurs across a region or within a certain area, but the rainfall that we're most concerned about, knowing that it'll be just as variable as we see across the state or a region, is that which might be on our own property. Now, most producers we know that do keep some sort of rainfall records. Problem is what do we do with it once we have that information? But one of the things that we created here at the Noble Foundation is what I call a water year rainfall table. And what we do is we take a look at the producer's existing rainfall through a year and compare it to a long-term monthly average. Now, I call it a water year rainfall table mainly because it coincides with what the drought monitor people utilize as a rainfall year. It begins in October after most forage production has ceased from a grass standpoint, and it continues to recharge within the water profile in the first half of the water year as we enter into the growing season. What we want to do is take long-term averages by inch starting in October and then accumulate them over the 12 months. Then what we do is we look at it cumulatively, adding month to month to see where we are throughout the water year, and then putting it into terms of a long-term average. We compare that to what would be the current year. In this example, this is a couple of years old. We'd be looking at the 2012 and the 2013 year. Again, we're comparing the same information from one year to the next, but also looking back, how does it look to the long-term average? And more importantly, what we want to know is the variance from average. If we're strongly negative or strongly positive, that gives us an indication where we are throughout the year, especially during the growing season, how much production we are above or below what would be expected. And as we get into April, May, and June, about the percentage that we are above or below normal would be a pretty good indication about how much we are above or below or should be relative to our stocking rate compared if we are at a conservative or near normal stocking rate or based on a near normal year. So it's a tool that we can use to kind of track our own rainfall compared to what would be regionally and see what it is on our operations. The other thing we want to do is also simultaneously be taking forage assessments throughout the year based on our critical dates. If we look at this and then compare that to our long-term outlook on the drought monitor, we find that we have opportunities to either be above or below within our forage production, and we can, as managers, begin to adjust accordingly. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do is be able to track our planned grazing throughout the year to what is actually occurring through strategic management decisions at the end of the year, how our forage expectation, our forage demand equate roughly to what our production has occurred. But using these type tools, we can actually better monitor where we are throughout the season as opposed to waiting to the end of the year and find ourselves short or overspent relative to our actual stocking rate. Moving on to the next portion of our pasture management considerations, we'll look on preventative management and recovery as it pertains to our pastures. Best way to manage preemptively to withstand some of the climate changes that can occur is just basically keep the ground covered. And in doing so, we need to manage our residuals. One of the easiest ways of doing this is set up a little bit of an exclosure that you can move every spring to a new location, but have a comparison between what you're actually grazing and what you're actually producing. It's one of the easiest ways to monitor production through the growing season. You can do this with native range. You can also do this with introduced pasture, just to give you an idea of where you are within a given year and within a given season, what you've grazed versus what you're actually produced. With perennial grasses, we all understand that it takes water to grow grass, but it also takes grass to grow grass. The shorter we graze our pastures when we do get moisture, the longer it takes for it to respond. If we maintain residuals for native range and around that 6 to 8 inch level, if we introduce pastures like Bermuda grass and fescue and keep it around that 4-inch height throughout the growing season, the grasses will respond quicker to whatever moisture that you do have, because it doesn't have to regenerate much tissue before it actually begins to amass some production. So keep in mind, even though it takes rain to grow grass, it takes grass to grow grass in these perennial systems. As we look at just at introduced pastures, we have to keep in mind that the introduced pastures were created to make efficient use of fertility. And one of the most important things we've got to do if we're going to be managing these pastures is manage the nutrients within them. For them to be optimal, to produce optimally, they need the excess nutrients because they've been developed to efficiently utilize nitrogen in particular so that they can produce maximum production. Now, that may not be exactly where you want to be as maximal, but even within an optimal situation, these highly productive pastures that are on very good soils can still make good use and efficient use of nutrients if we manage it correctly. So always keep in mind you've got to manage your soil nutrients within these soils in order to keep them healthy and sustainable. For fertilizer, weed spray, as we look at our introduced pastures, these are two critical components that we need to factor into our management in order to maintain a healthy introduced pasture. One of the other things we got to think about too is when you've got these introduced pastures, and even on a native range standpoint, when we grazed a little heavily, oftentimes we'll find that annuals begin to come in early in the growing season. As a result, they oftentimes rob perennial pasture of some of the early spring moisture, and in the case of Bermuda grass or fescue, they could actually rob grasses of the nutrients as well. That we may want to remove some of the excess annuals. Now, we always like spring to come on early. There's a limit to amount of annuals that the cattle can adequately graze. On a cow-calf basis, if you can manage for about 1 acre per cow unit for the annuals, that ought to be adequate to allow spring to come on early, but you want to remove the excess perennials from the remainder of your perennial pasture, especially on the most productive sites, because we'll leave that production later in the growing season. Same thing when it comes to a native range. If you know that grazed an area a little harder, as we often find ourselves doing, so in a drought, and you know that you've got a good native stand underneath it, we may find that we have weeds that will come in early in the season and overtake and shade out a lot of our desirable grasses there at the beginning of the spring. Just using some strategic herbicide applications, even though we wouldn't want to do it on a routine basis, but if we can apply herbicide strategically early in the growing season, we can remove the weeds that may be inhibiting the forage production and recovery on some of these pastures. Just as a rule of thumb, when you know you've got a good perennial stand, a pound of weeds will displace at least a pound of grass. Oftentimes, very economical as well as very beneficial to the sustainability and recovery of some of these pastures that have been abused somewhat during an adverse grazing period. So keep that in mind as we're trying to recover some of these native pastures, especially if it's a very productive site. Also, remember, it's difficult to manage what you do not measure. And one of the easiest ways to do that is utilize these exposures just so that you have an idea of what forage production is actually occurring throughout the season. Within the rangelands and our native grasses, there's a couple of tools that are very useful just to maintain land stewardship and seeing if you can improve some of these rangelands, keep them in a more productive state. These are two examples, the land EKG or bullseye monitoring systems. These are something that can be incorporated on an annual basis in order to help you manage your native rangelands to a more productive state. Just to give you an idea of just how important range condition is, if we just take these 3 range sites from southwest Oklahoma, you can see that from range condition drops from excellent down to poor, there's a significant amount of forage production that is lost. So trying to maintain your range condition as high as possible is extremely important, because the higher your range condition, the more production that you actually can occur, and from an economic standpoint, the more livestock you can carry. If we just take a look at this clay flat range site, examine it a little bit closer, we can put what that forage production means relative to a stocking range. The number of acres per cow, and then if we look at the different sizes of cattle, 1,300 pound cow versus 1,100 pound cow, we can see that as stocking rate decreases, it takes more acres of land in order to sustain the same cow without any type of supplementation or supplemental feeding for a year-long basis. So it's really important to pay attention as managers to manage our pastures for a higher range condition as we go forward. Same thing if we just look at year-to-year changes. If we have rainfall that goes above by 15% or below 15% of average, we can see that on that same range site that's in excellent condition, the stocking rate fluctuations probably should be in order to match up with our carrying capacity. So managing the stocking rate, managing forage on these range sites is really important to maintain optimal production from season to season, year to year. Again, we will be able to compare this back to our water year rainfall table and the variances as we go forward. Knowing where we are within any given year, using the information from our own operation, we can tell where we should be relative to our stocking rate and project our expectations of our carrying capacity as the season progresses. Extremely important information when we begin to manage our perennial pastures. E.J. House, who was one of the fathers of range management, back in the 50s made a statement. He said, "A man whose pastures are short needs rain the most. However, a man whose pastures are in good shape makes the most of the rain he gets." In other words, we want to maintain our pastures in as good a condition as possible so that when we do get the rainfall, the pastures can bounce back, be able to provide the production that is needed as compared to a pasture that's overgrazed. Just as an example, where we saw the different range conditions, the better the range condition that we can maintain our pastures, the more production we can maintain. Therefore, the more cattle we'll be able to carry over the long term. Finally, what we want to talk a little bit about are some of the other considerations we need to take into account relative to pasture management. The first thing is we are going to experience drought. And when that occurs, we may be forced to identify an area that we're going to have to feed cattle longer than we would prefer. Use the least productive soils as your sacrifice area. Identify an area that you're going to sacrifice, abuse, if you're going to go into a feeding program. Try to maintain your most productive soils for as long as possible. Keep the cattle off of it, especially as you go through a long-term dry spell. Hopefully, you're not going to have to maintain these cattle in a sacrifice area for a long periods, but this is something that you need to identify ahead of time. Should this occur and you don't have the options and you want to try to hold on for just a little bit longer, the best thing to do is to identify areas that's going to be least impactful to your operation. Typically, these are on the range sites would be your least productive ones, or those that are rocky or breaks type soils, or even better, if you have an introduced pasture, that might be an ideal area in order to use as a sacrifice or an abuse area. Mainly because within introduced pastures, we can fertilize, do a little bit of weed spray, and get rapid recovery. Rangelands, when they're extremely abused, take much, much longer if they ever recover. So keep that in mind as you manage for sacrificed areas. In this example, looking for these areas that are either red or uncolored or yellow, these are going to be the areas in this operation in particular that would be ideal sites for a sacrifice area. The other thing we want to be able to do is enhance our livestock watering capacity. One of the things we learned in the droughts of 2011 and 2012, even the guys that had good pasture could not use it if they didn't have water. So when we have opportunities and we know that you have pastures that are at risk should drinking water become limited, especially during a long dry spell, those are the ones that would be great candidates to begin to figure out a way to enhance your water holding capacity for livestock drinking water, just so that you can make use of these pastures should the drinking water within the pastures, stock ponds, might become dry. Something that we have encouraged our producers really to begin looking at, because it couldn't help sustain the livestock operation. The other thing we want to do is keep in mind is when you are in a drought condition, not all areas of the country are typically in a drought too. If you're a large enough operation, you may want to consider moving cattle to an area that's not being impacted by drought for a defined period. Often that's more cost effective than trying to feed through the drought conditions. The other thing that we typically encourage producers to investigate or try to sign up for is some of the risk management options that are available to you, either through the FSA or through the risk management agencies, similar to what we have an example on this slide, the pasture range and forage insurance. And with this particular producer, you can see that the people at these agencies can actually do some analytics to look at, if you participated in these programs, what would be most beneficial to you relative to the history that we have within county information. So in this example, this producer here, which isn't far from Ardmore, Oklahoma, he was able to figure, if the program had been effective since back into the 80s, that over the 22 years they ran the example, he would have netted about $31 per cow based on the terms that you see on the slide. If he just looked at those years that we were in a drought, he averaged over $200 per cow return back into his operation. It's not to say that it's going to replace all your costs or out-of-pocket costs, but it certainly helps you mitigate some of the financial damage that can occur into the operation by participation. But in order to participate, you need to visit with your agencies in order to find out what it takes to qualify and make sure that you're signed in a timely fashion. These are just some of the tools that we need to be thinking about. In summary, as we look at the pasture management considerations, the main thing that we want to do is begin by drought-proofing the ranch. And the first thing we do is set a stocking rate that is somewhat conservative so that we can begin to manage proactively as opposed to reacting. We want to utilize our rainfall and pasture production records as tools so that we can make more timely decisions within years as well as across years. We also want to maintain ground cover and the residues within these pastures. The best course of preemptive management is management of the ground cover and these residues so that we can maintain the resiliency within these systems, especially when they hit some of these adverse records. As we talked about within ground cover, we've got to keep the ground not only covered, but we want to maintain residuals out there so that when we do get a rainfall, the forages can bounce back rapidly. Recovery can include such things as strategic herbicide treatments as well as rest and recovery. In specific instances when we need our perennial grasses to bounce back rapidly, make an assessment to control either weeds or some of the cool season annuals, we can gain years of recovery within one season by timely treating some of these pastures so that they can recover within that season. And then if we're going to experience adverse weather conditions, we want to be prepared for them as best we can. Identify your sacrifice areas that you know that if you're going to have to feed, you can afford to abuse because it's going to affect your stocking rate and your carrying capacity the least amount by sacrificing these as the feeding area. In the meantime, you always want to be able to enhance your water capacity, especially if you've got areas that you know are at risk of running out of drinking water for livestock during drought conditions. By enhancing the water capacity, you'll be able to utilize resources that otherwise would be rendered useless because of lack of water. And finally, assess and investigate the available risk management tools that you have as pasture managers. There's some new programs there that are supported by our government and through the risk management agencies. And these insurance type tools provide an opportunity for producers to help mitigate some of the financial risks that are associated with drought type conditions. With that, that concludes our two-part series on stocking rate decisions and pasture management considerations. If there are questions, we'd always be happy to answer those. The best way to do that would be contact your local extension and or NRCS personnel or other pasture range consultants and professionals within your region. With that, thank you. Have a great day.